You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. Today we're going to be talking about religious freedom. Our special guests are Andrew Kubick and Nathaniel Hurd, both of the Religious Freedom Institute. Kubick is Deputy Director of the National Center for Religious Freedom Education and a research fellow in Bioethics and Medical Conscience. He has a Ph.D. in Bioethics from the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum. He is published in the Catholic Journal on Religious Freedom and Healthcare, Dignitas, Ethics and Medics, National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, Public Discourse, and St. John Paul II Journal of Bioethics. His first book, Transplanting the Womb, a Catholic Bioethical Analysis, is due out this fall. Nathaniel Hurd is Director of the North American Action Team and Senior Fellow for Public Policy for the Religious Freedom Institute. He holds a Master's of International Affairs from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Hurd worked as Senior Policy Advisor for the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. In addition to advising legislators, he directed hearings, monitored elections in Europe, and represented the United States with the United Nations and World Bank. He has spent time overseas with many survivors of violence. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit, we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Valerie, can you get us launched?
Yes. Well, I am curious, and whoever feels moved to answer first, but gentlemen, what got you so interested in the topic of religious freedom and specifically your professional commitment to it?
Andrew, let's start with you.
I think Nathaniel just deferred to me. So thank you first. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Really look forward to this conversation. I started my career in teaching elementary school. Actually, I taught elementary school for about 8 years. And when my first son was born, my wife and I discussed from very early on that we wanted a parent to be home. I was a tenured teacher at the time, had no desire to leave public education. My wife was not tenured at the time, so we decided until my wife received her tenure, I would stay home. It was at that point that I know the typical advice is that you're supposed to sleep when your baby sleeps. I went back to school while my baby slept and was very tired throughout. But nevertheless, It was there where I started my formal Catholic education. Now, I went to Catholic school. My mother and father sacrificed K through 12, but I was a bit immature academically in a lot of ways. But it was at that point that I actually delved really deep into the material. And Holy Apostles College and Seminary up in Cromwell, Connecticut, is where I went for my schooling for my master's, postmaster's certificate, both in theology. And there I had the first taste, the intellectual pursuit of what religion is, the good of religion, but also the whispers. And I say whispers because there was no formal class on it. It was actually mostly my Catholic social teaching course. But nevertheless, that undercurrent of the importance of defending our freedom, our ability to seek out a faith, to test it, and then to embrace it. And so that really began my formal inquiry into it and my interest. God called my wife and my family, my children, down to Virginia, where I taught at a Catholic high school, Dominican high school, St. John Paul the Great. And through God's providence, what was the course that I was selected to teach? Catholic social teaching. And nothing helps you better understand material than when you're forced to teach it. So one of the aspects to the course, one of the modules we did was on religious freedom. And so there I had to dive even deeper in order to give that background to my students. And again, with God's providence, one day my principal asked me to meet with one of our board members at the time, and his name is Tom Farr. Tom Farr is one of the founding members and president emeritus now. Nevertheless, remarkable man, remarkable figure in the world of religious freedom, especially international religious freedom. And we sat down and we talked. We talked about bioethics. We talked about high school teaching. And he invited me to come to RFI part-time to work on developing a high school curriculum, one that can be used in Catholic schools as well as non-Catholic schools, all the way to public schools, homeschool, etc. And again, when you're forced to teach, you really have to dive deep. And so for 5 years, I worked in education under Tom Farr, then under David Trimble, who's our VP now. And it was only a few months ago, 3 months, it's been a blur, but 3 months ago I was invited to come on full time. And so that's what led me here to this process. Now, personally, I cannot think of anything more important to defend. Defending life and defending religious freedom are the two most important defenses we can make. And so my bioethics background, of course, I think has equipped me well to defend life. And my formation at Holy Apostles and my formation here at RFI has really helped form me to defend religious freedom as well.
So on my side of the ledger, we know, of course, that the reality has both a natural and a supernatural dimension to it. There's a supernatural order and a natural order to things. And it's always important that we have both the natural and the supernatural perspective. So from a natural perspective, you and I shouldn't be having this conversation right now. I was an unbaptized atheist until about age 22. I would have been completely opposed to religious freedom, at least religious freedom for certain kinds of people, certainly Catholics. I was convinced that religion was just a fiction, a fabrication. The people who were religious were either unintelligent or intelligent, but had suspended their intelligence. I would have told you at the time that you profess what you profess, you believe what you believed, because it makes you feel better. It's an emotional crutch of some kind, or you grew up that way and you were told to think this, and you haven't really learned anything else. You haven't taken the time to understand why this is all completely fictional. So that was me until about age 22. And then it was actually through a friendship with a Catholic that I became open to the possibility that at least God existed. I didn't know one way or the other, but at least I was open. And as we know, God is a God of invitation to relationship. He doesn't force himself on us, but there needs to be some openness. And so I had finally become open. And then there was a period of agnosticism. Does God exist? Does he not exist? I don't know. Waffling back and forth. And then ultimately just some very dramatic moments of conversion, sort of a Paul on the road to Damascus like encounter. I started going to an Episcopalian church. I was living in New York City at the time. I started going to an Episcopalian church, but became convinced that I wasn't hearing the entire story. And so ultimately, through some friendships and again, some very dramatic moments of conversion, became Catholic in 2005. So I went from being non-religious and anti-religious, and to some degree anti-religious freedom, all the way now to being Catholic and advocating for and defending religious freedom. And some of the kind of pivots along the way were my work focused on the policy aspects of international conflicts and disasters in places like Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. There was often a religious dimension to it, that people were in some cases animated to commit violence because of their own skewed understanding of their own religion. The terrorist group ISIS would be an example of that. But also people being targeted because of their religion. And so that sort of piqued my interest. And then ultimately I was asked to come on as a professional staffer, a nonpartisan staffer for a bicameral, bipartisan congressional commission. This is the Helsinki Commission. It's been around since the mid-1970s, focuses on the former Soviet Union, Europe, all of Europe, a little bit in the Middle East and North Africa, and the United States and Canada. So members of Congress from both chambers, both parties. And I was the religious freedom guy, and also focusing on atrocities, things like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and then humanitarian emergencies as well. And then ultimately, my friends at RFI, my dear friends who were some of my closest collaborators, asked me to come to RFI to lead a lot of our work focused on religious freedom challenges and threats here in the United States. So in human terms, this is all completely inexplicable. Obviously, God in his perfect providence knew what he was doing and knew that I would land here eventually. But it has certainly been a surprising and unexpected journey in many ways.
Thank you for that background, both of you. Mario, you want to take us ahead now?
Well, I think I should. Good morning. I'm very curious about the whole issue of religious freedom, but I have a question. I don't know if it's relevant to our talk here, but I think it is. I see religious freedom an issue, not as much as what religion in itself means, rather what freedom in itself means. Let me elaborate a little bit. Today in Latin America, the catchword is freedom. Everyone wants freedom. And those who claim freedom are the ones who, at the end, are more authoritarian. But everyone talk about freedom as we speak. Now, in your context that you talk about religious freedom, what do we mean, or what do we have to understand about freedom? I know that's a philosophical question, but I think philosophy is necessary, I think, here, in order to clarify what we're talking about.
Andrew, maybe if I could just tee you up to
Sure.
take a first stab at it. You want to say a word about why it is that in our curriculum, so Andrew had alluded to this earlier, we've developed what we understand to be the only religious freedom-focused curriculum in the United States for use in colleges and universities and high schools and soon middle schools. Why we begin, before we even get to this very important question of freedom and what it is and how we exercise it, why we actually start by defining religion, talking about why religion is natural to the human person.
Yeah, thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Mario, for the question. So really, we're asking two different things. What precisely is religion? And then what is freedom? And then we can marry the two and understand better what is religious freedom. So as Nathaniel said, we start our curriculum with philosophical anthropology. What does it mean to be human? And that's I think the proper place to start. What does it mean to be a human person? What is a human act? What distinguishes us from other animals? And I think Thomas Aquinas really gave us such a great understanding of the distinction, following Aristotle and trying to understand and separate different types of beings to understand the greatest capacities of them. Thomas Aquinas said we have a natural inclination, humans have a natural inclination to know the truth. And not just the truth about, as Nathaniel alluded to in his intro, about the material world. We can know that. We seek that every day, especially in the sciences. But to know the truth about the immaterial, something that's greater than human. And so this is distinctly a human exercise, a human faculty. And so what is religion? First off, religion is the search, the pursuit for something greater than us, greater than human. But not just to know that it's out there, but to understand how it brought us into being, and also how it gives ultimate meaning to our life. It gives us that end that we're all aiming towards. And once we recognize it, and I love that 1 Thessalonians verse, once we test all things, and we find out what is good, and we find out what is true, then we have a duty to embrace it, and not only embrace it, but ours is a life of action. We know our being through God, but then our being requires us to act. And so there I would say also an expression of one's faith. And so at RFI, we say that it's 3 E's. And I like this as a teacher. I like the little hints like this, the strategies. It's 3 E's. It's to explore, embrace, and express. Now, with all that being said, that's kind of our formal definition, that human search for a greater than human source of being and ultimate meaning. That's our definition of religion. And I think it squares very well, by the way, with Dignitatis Humanae. But when it comes to the truth of freedom, this is also another deeply human exercise. Because only is man capable of searching for truth, knowing what is good, and God willing, acting on it. I mean, that's again a deeply human exercise. And so freedom is a notion that I think has been misaligned, confused, maybe deliberately redefined. But freedom is the ability to do what we ought, not necessarily the ability to do what we want. And so therein lies why religious freedom is so important, because it's the freedom or the ability to exercise one's duty to seek that truth in their life, that natural inclination, as Aquinas talks about, to test all things, find out what is good. And once you test it and you find that truth, we have a duty to embrace it, and not only embrace it, but to have it manifested in our actions and the way we live. And so that's the freedom that we ought to do what is good. How does this go in terms of a bigger picture when we're talking about, well, does religious freedom permit everything? Well, religious freedom is not absolute. It doesn't permit anything. Freedom itself, we have to look at, again, through that lens of being able to do what we ought, not necessarily what we want. God willing, we want to do what we ought, but as fallen creatures, that's not always the case. And so there lies what some of our founders have written in the original text, that when we have moral and virtuous people, freedom is robust and it ought to be protected. And really, government ought to step aside and let man be man, following God, following the dictates of his heart, following what his conscience knows to be good. But the further we fall away from morality and virtue, therein lies the government coming, because we've lost that true sense of freedom. We're no longer seeking that which is good. We're seeking that which we define or attribute goodness to. And so I think that when we talk about religious freedom, we have to know what religion is, a proper understanding of freedom, which sadly I think is lost too often in today's culture. And then once we have that proper definition, protect it and defend it and teach it, because otherwise we're going to have a government coming in and imposing their morality and virtue on us because they say our sense of morality and virtue is lost.
Did that wedding come off, Mario? That wedding of freedom and religion, did that come off?
There is all of your presentation is brilliant. I agree with you, but I don't think the world.
What? I've heard him say that once before, people. It was 2 years ago. Continue.
I'm done. Have a good day. Thank you. I'm going to leave on a high note.
You didn't hear the second part.
Oh, there it is.
But the issue, I think, the world doesn't share your views because you presupposes there an order, there is a morality, there is a few things before you claim about freedom. The world doesn't understand freedom that way. The freedom they understand is, well, act as you please. And so how then we go about and give someone a right to do whatever he pleases or she pleases? Now, that, let's call it libertarian view of freedom, is worldwide, is even in the church, so to speak. So how my concern is that how then we go about really and talk about religious freedom based on a notion of what is an order that presupposes that freedom, what is human nature. Now, we talk about human nature here, we understand each other, but the world doesn't share this view. And so my concern is that, politically speaking, in the practical world, we have to deal with other issues. Now, in other words, this paradox, we need to go through this libertarian freedom in order to understand the true freedom. How to do that? To me, it's an open question. I see the solution, quote unquote, that people are proposing, but those solutions are leading us to a totalitarian system. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's very optimistic, my assessment.
I just want to throw in one more thing and then see if Nathaniel has anything to add to this. But I think the best way we approach this in a secular culture, a culture that's becoming further and further away from Judeo-Christianity, or further and further away from natural law, as you said, human nature. I mean, to bring up the question of the nature of either person or act is one of the most challenging things in today's culture. Because there is no such thing as nature. It's how I define it, as kind of you alluded to. And so I think what we have to, a good place to start, because this is a conversation that we have to start with things that we share in common. So for example, the notion of justice. We talk about, you say about a libertarian or a liberty approach, or almost, I would say almost a license approach. I get to just name whatever is good, even though it's not. Well, we all still understand our people of different faiths, people of no faith, people of a secular culture, government, etc. We all still understand that there are boundaries, lines that we don't cross, a sense of justice, if you will. So, for example, property rights, the right of my personal physical integrity. Even though we may have different language for why we respect the rights of others with regard to property or person, we all still recognize that it's unjust and punishable if one's conscience is so ill-informed that they think it's right to harm an innocent human being. We agree, even in the secular culture that has kind of dismissed or rejected God, sadly, we agree that this is something that we ought not to do and that ought to be punished if somebody chooses to do it. And so that right there is not the answer to your question, but I think that is the system or strategy we use. What are the things that we understand? What are the things that we have in common? What are those notions, what I would say truths, of natural law that you get, even if you're not willing to admit that it comes from a religious or God-centered place. Because as a secular culture, we do get it. It's not absolute liberty. It's not absolute license. There has to be rule of law. The problem I find, and why these conversations are so desperately important, is because we've grown as a culture that can't have conversation anymore about things we disagree with. And when we can't have these conversations, we can't share the truth. It becomes very difficult to evangelize. And therefore, the government has to come in more and more. And you mentioned a totalitarian state. Well, if there's lawlessness because people think license ought to rule the day, then yes, you're going to have a state that's becoming more and more, hammered down on the people. So I think the answer to your question is yes, you may find plenty of people who disagree on what the meaning of freedom is. But we have to start with what we share in common, what we see, and we can both agree on, even if we explain it in different ways and use that as almost a natural law, even if that's the language we use, a natural law strategy to open up the larger realm of what it is we're talking about. In this case, what is freedom? But Nathaniel, I defer to you if you have anything to add to that as well.
Just a few additions. I was recently reading a really fascinating reflection by the theologian Larry Chapp, taught for a long time, and then he and his wife ultimately founded a Catholic worker farm in Pennsylvania. And what he was arguing was that it used to be that you looked at atheists like Nietzsche, who took religion seriously. They engaged with it. There was a vigorous response to it. Whereas now we find ourselves in a situation where increasingly you have modern people who just think, well, that's just passé. We're beyond that. We're not really going to engage with that anymore, which is a very different environment. I mean, I would say first and foremost, as different popes have commented on over the years, that first and foremost, we're called to witness. That the most compelling teachers are firstly witnesses. And so I think what's incumbent upon religious people of a range of faith traditions is to exercise their religious freedom in a compelling and an attractive and winsome way, to the extent that we're seen as just the people of thou shalt not, or angry and cranky and reactionary and all of that. That's not going to be very compelling to people in the public square. But I think also it's necessary to make distinctions, because you have some people who are adamantly opposed to religious freedom for or at least full religious freedom for Catholics and Muslims and Orthodox Jews, and people who we might say are more on the morally orthodox side of things when it comes to the human person, life and marriage and family and human sexuality, males and females. But then you have a lot of people in the middle who, on the one hand are not, they don't spend their days advocating for religious freedom, but on the other hand, they're not necessarily against it. I think there are a lot of people that fall into that middle category. And so I think, one, just living our lives in a compelling and winsome way, but also really maybe prioritizing those people in the middle, those people who have not been completely lost to the ideologies of the day. The other thing that I would just say is that we've seen with many different ideologies over the course of human history that ultimately they collapse, or at least, if not a complete collapse, a partial collapse. Ideology, of course, is always antithetical to truth, and people that are affirming the truth and advancing the truth will always be the targets of ideologues. But one of the text that has just been a very significant point of reference for me over the years is Faith in the Future by then Father Joseph Ratzinger. So before he even became a bishop, he did a series of radio addresses, radio talks, and I think it was 1969, and then it was ultimately turned into a book. And the last chapter is called "What Will the Future Church Look Like?" And one of the things that he really emphasizes there is the importance of just being salt and light, being the mustard seed, and then putting things in God's hands and really leaving it at that. And I think that really is the right way of looking at it. It's very easy to become overwhelmed when we look at the scale of the challenges, the scale of the threats to religious liberty, the scale of people who are either avowed atheists or at least practically atheists in how they see the world and how they live their lives. And so when you're faced with that, this sort of what seems like a cultural tsunami, it's very easy to be tempted to just run, or, what can we do? First and foremost, it's just at the personal level, it's being faithful. And I think ultimately, one of the points that Father Ratzinger made in those reflections is that people who follow these ideologies will become, to use his phrase, unspeakably lonely. And then they will look around and they will see people who are living life in a more beautiful and attractive way. And I think what we're seeing now is that, these ideologies like sexual orientation and gender identity ideology, for example, that one, it has become totalitarian, as ideologies always do. And two, the people that are propagating them have overreached. And also people that are trying to live them out. I mean, someone who has, life-changing, some kind of life-changing surgical procedure to change being male or female, or they're convinced that it will change them from being a male to a female, or vice versa. But they're still unhappy. They're desperately unhappy. And so I think at the end of the day, people who are trying to, still live out the sexual revolution and all of its bad after effects, many of them will find that they're just not happy. They thought it would make them happy, and it hasn't. I mean, Andrew referred earlier to St. Thomas Aquinas, this distinction he makes between the creator and the created, and the finite and the infinite. And of course, St. Augustine's famous observation that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, to the extent that people think that filling their lives with more and more and more of that which is finite, whether it is sex or money or some other kind of pleasure, if they think that this will make them happy, they discover that ultimately it does not. And so I think it leads to people starting to be skeptical about some of these ideologies. It takes time, and a lot of people are hurt in the meantime. But I think in terms of advancing freedom, part of it is the unmasking of the ideologies which ultimately are the enemies of freedom.
That's a terrific addition. I'd like to ask Nathaniel in particular to comment on an analogy that I'm going to propose. And I'm going to propose the analogy because I want to bring the conversation around to the nuns with an O, not a U. It's sometimes said that politics refers to that which we have to do all together. And if you have that idea of politics, you don't take kindly to those who want to be apolitical. And there have been any number of political thinkers that have railed against political indifference. And there are particular jurisdictions where, for example, there's no choice about voting. You have to vote. That would be a policy application of the view that since politics is something that we all have to do together, everybody better get together and engage in politics. Now, suppose we shift to religion. If we think of religion as constructed, as developed, as ordered to our ultimate end, and some people say, Well, not for me. I'm a nun, especially in light of the totalitarian bent that a great many religions have had. Should we say, fine, go ahead? Or should we say that the recognition of a right to not be religious at all, well, that's a temporary sort of right. In the end, everyone ought to be religious. What should we think about such questions, Nathaniel?
So firstly, when encountering someone like that as a religious person, I think the starting point is just asking them questions, learning more about their journey, learning more about their story, their personal history. Like what, I'm glad you shared this with me. Tell me more about your experience with religious people. Religion, of course, is not some sort of abstract thing. Ultimately, it's manifested by people. And so, did you grow up in a particularly religious home? And then, hearing more about that, are there people or friends or colleagues or others that you've encountered over the years? And then you can also start to ask questions about some of their premises, because I think ultimately, it isn't just about God. It isn't just about religion. It also has to do with a particular understanding of reality. So is reality something that is created that I receive, or is reality something that I manufacture? Am I created, or do I create myself? And a lot of that has a lot of implications for how somebody understands faith and religion and God and so forth. So I think part of it is just learning more from that person, asking them a lot of questions. Certainly people who are convicted of their religious views at different points of human history, including to this day, have sought to impose that on others through coercion and violence. And, that is coercion. It is never justifiable to use coercion to force someone to hold a set of views about matters of religion. This should be, and Andrew mentioned this before, it should be a free exercise. Religion, it's interestingly, this term has crept into a lot of international settings, the United Nations, other fora, freedom of religion or belief. It's interesting that the or belief part was something that was especially propagated by the Soviet Union in international negotiations and fora during the Cold War. But ultimately, religious freedom includes the right to not believe. It isn't an argument that is a good, but it is recognizing that coercion is not justifiable in trying to force someone to adhere to something. So that's part of it. And the other thing that I would just say is that, to the one who is the nun, ideally these conversations are happening in the context of friendship. Whether it's a family member, whether it's someone you went to school with, or a colleague, or someone like that, because partly, I started when I went through the year-long process of, I guess what then was called the Rite of Christiation for adults. I think it's been retitled recently, but basically the year-long period of preparation for someone who is going to become Catholic. I started grad school at the same time. So I was at Columbia University, one of the most elite and exclusive international affairs program in the world, with all the attitudes that go with that. And my classmates were just completely perplexed. I was very open about the fact that I was doing this, that I was becoming Catholic, and it was completely perplexing with them because I think in their mind, I was a peer. I was an intellectual peer. We had a lot of the same interests. I had classes with them. I struck them as being, not an idiot, reasonably intelligent. And yet I was doing this thing. And to them, they didn't see how these two things fit together. And I've certainly been in professional settings as well, where, somebody has in mind the stereotype about the serious religious person, about the serious Christian, about the serious Catholic. And if you live in a way that's contrary to that stereotype, to that impression that they have, well, that's something that they have to deal with. You're a fact. Their stereotype or impression is not, they may have met someone who met that stereotype or that impression, but you are contrary to that. And they can either just persist in, okay, despite all the evidence in front of me, I'm going to hold this view of you. Or, well, maybe there's something else going on here. And so I think just the person also is, I think, just a critic, and how you live, how you manifest your faith is just a critical aspect of that engagement. But yeah, at the end of the day, it has always been an error to try and force people into holding certain religious convictions through force, through violence, through coercion. And all of us, and no matter how much we might want someone who says, well, I don't believe in any God whatsoever, God doesn't exist, however much we might want them to think otherwise, we have to affirm, back to Andrew's point about holding something in common, that coercion should never be used to force people to either believe or to not believe.
All right, so no coercion. Mario.
Well, that if that is the case in your definition of religion, you may include the Church of Satan, Satanism. Do you?
Andrew, you first, and I'll weigh in, because we've actually, this example has come up because they have tried to claim religious protections and exemptions and other things as well. And so, yeah.
Let me elaborate a little bit. As far as I understand, one thing is religious sense. Another thing is Christian faith or Buddhist principles. In other words, one thing is the nature that we have and share as human beings who are searching for truth. Another issue is how we respond that. For us, we have a gift, the gift of revelation, which somehow have given an answer to our search. Now, if you apply this view to somebody else who have not received that gift and have make things up along the way and say, well, I believe in Satan, I believe in something else. So the question is, are we going to include those kind of responses to our religious sense as well?
Andrew, thank you, Mario. I think it's a great question. So I think that I think we want to make a few distinctions. Number one, the distinction, and Nathaniel alluded to this, between religion and belief. The freedom to believe something, I don't know how you necessarily test for that or somehow try to monitor that. I mean, we're really free to believe whatever we so choose to believe. And so to say that a Satanist, for example, someone from the Satanic Temple, believes in Satan. Well, I mean, we believe in Satan too, by the way. As Christians, we certainly do. I mean, we understand that this is not something, I mean, this is the highest of the angels who fell from the sky. But the fact of claiming, though, that a belief rises to the test of what could be defined from a civil perspective as a religion, I think that is a very, very tall stretch of the definition of religion. I think when you're talking about the Satanic Temple, for example, we would want to kind of investigate, because so much of this is circumstantial. Is it a rejection of Christianity? Because if you look at the Satanic Temple, I think, if I remember correctly, one of their pillars is that it's more so a rejection of the good and Christianity in particular than it is the worship of Satan. Well, in that case, then we've just kind of moved away from our definition of the search for truth about a greater than human source of being and ultimate meaning. It's more of a rejection of a religion. And so there, when you have individuals who choose, and let's even
Excuse me, we're
off of
getting a
Satanist,
bit of feedback now, and I'm not quite sure why. It's tricky.
No, I'm sorry. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Well, when we don't say anything, we don't get any feedback.
So I'll try that again. Can you hear me okay?
I don't know, but Andrew, maybe if you just were not quite so close to the mic, it might not be you at all.
Okay.
Are you in?
Because I hear something in the background too.
I'm wondering if you are audible to one another in the facility that you're in. Is your computer audio? Can you hear? Are we hearing you in a building on the other's computer?
Let's try that. Nathaniel, can you mute your microphone while I'm speaking and see if that helps? Okay, so I'll speak now and we'll see if it works. And Jim, please stop me if it's not working well. But as I was saying, if you look at the pillars of the Satanic Temple, for example, theirs is not one that even rises to the test of what a religion is, because it's more so a rejection. And so therein, they would rely on other freedoms, other rights that we have enshrined in our Bill of Rights. For example, the freedom of speech, a tremendously robust freedom, and they could make the claims that they claim, and the freedom to assemble, also a tremendously robust freedom. However, to say that one has the right to say something that they believe and the right to gather with other people who believe that does not necessarily rise to the definition of what it means to have a religion. And so I would say that I would want to look and talk to, or at least research individual cases. So the Satanists, the Satanic Temple, what are they truly claiming? And does that actually meet the standard? The problem I find, though, with Satanism in general is that religion is meant to drive us to the good. It's meant to be a vehicle, if you will. I mean, truly, it's a duty we owe to God, but it's a vehicle by which we rise to God. And we enter into a deeper and deeper relationship with Him who is good. And I think the problem is if you find people who claim that their religion, quote unquote, and again, we'd have to kind of unpack that to see if it truly is, if it meets that criteria. I don't think in this case of the Satanists, because the claim that one worships, whether you call God, Christ, whether you call him by another name according to another religion, Satanism rejects the notion of the good in order to embrace the antithesis of that. And so I don't even think in that case we would have that claim that this is a religion that seeks the good.
The other thing that I would just add is that we've also, in looking into actually this particular question about this particular group, we have found, whether it's on their websites or elsewhere, things in which they explicitly say that they don't really believe in the supernatural. That they do hold a set of things to be dear, but they don't even believe in the supernatural. So even though they call themselves, the Church of Satan or the Temple of Satan, they don't believe in the supernatural. The other thing that's also just worth mentioning is that in some cases, whether it's with this group or with others, it's only ever invoked to. I mean, for example, one of the things that followed the ending of Roe, the Dobbs decision, was that you had some people who were professing to be Muslims or some people professing to be Jews who said, I have a right as a matter of religious freedom to have access to abortion. And you could extend that out further and say, I'm a medical practitioner and I have the right to, as far as my religion goes, I have the right to practice this. And of course, the response to that is, when we probe, when we test, the only time and the only area in which you basically show evidence of being religious is just over this one thing, so that you can do this one thing. which suggests that this is not really sincere, that you think that, okay, there's this thing that I want, and the way that I can get it is to say that I am part of this religion and I am now invoking religious freedom. But let's look at other aspects. Is there any other aspects of your life in which you can demonstrate that you order your life according to this religion? Well, that's interesting. It's only about this one thing or these two things. So I think there are other ways in which you can show pretty clearly that either A, you don't believe in the supernatural at all, which is a predicate for religion, or B, this is not sincere, because the only area of your life in which we can find you making a claim about being religious is this thing that you want that you may not be able to do right now.
I think Mario probably wants to get back on this, but it's also the case that
Valerie,
next.
Well, I just think this is.
May I add just one more thing?
Please.
I'm sorry. One line, just response to that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Valerie. I apologize.
No,
but even if the courts were to say that, and you fill in the blank with the religion, religious freedom is not absolute. It should be highly regarded and robustly protected. But simply because if a group were to say, this is a religious freedom claim, my religion, how I understand it, compels me to do X. And the courts, for example, would say, well, that meets our threshold of religion. This is a religious freedom claim. X is not necessarily permitted. And so I just wanted to add that too, because I think that's an important lens to view all of this. Yes, we're trying to get to the bottom of what religion is, religious freedom, how it extends to what it extends. But I also think it's important to just also say that even in the context of religious freedom, it ought to be directed towards the good. And when it's not, when it crosses that line, we will see the courts step in, as they ought to, because they're supposed to be the guarantors, the protectors, the last bastion, if you will, of the good. And so I just wanted to add that too. I didn't want to make it seem like if you were to make a religious freedom claim that really withstood scrutiny, that just gives you license to do whatever you'd like either. So I'm sorry, Valerie, I just wanted to add that.
No, that's good. This is all such helpful perspective that you're both bringing. I hear that echo. It's distracting. I don't know what's going on with that, but we tried. So I was going to say, speaking of Satan, I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate here. You've spoken well about the need to begin with common ground. You've spoken well about the robustness of certain rights and freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution, for example. Wouldn't it be simpler and easier, frankly, to just stick with securing civil liberties on the government's part? Why should governments have not just a regard for religious freedom, but a special regard for religious freedom?
Nathaniel, why don't you take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can just begin with the founders. The founders' view was that religion and religious people and their institutions and organizations were essential for a virtuous society. Not a guarantor, of course, but were essential. And furthermore, were a really important check on government. Tyranny, I suppose, would be the term that they would have used at the time. That if your ultimate allegiance, if your ultimate point of reference is to someone, something outside of yourself, something beyond yourself, something supernatural, something that is not the government, then a free people are more likely to resist tyranny. To not accept it. So I think that's one aspect. And the other thing that I would just say is that, I mean, one of the religion and religious freedom are goods in and of themselves, but one of the things that we look at the Religious Freedom Institute all the time, as well as others, is there's a lot of evidence, social science evidence, that religion, religious freedom are critical to human flourishing. That, whether it is in the domain of economics or security or whatever it may be, it reinforces the other freedoms as well. That when you have, as Andrew alluded to in the very beginning, when you have these basic questions, these existential questions that all human people have, or at least are made to have and want to seek answers to and then live in accord with, that when you are prevented, and especially prevented by force, from doing the most natural thing that you can do as a human person, that is consequences. All sorts of knock-on consequences. People will resist that. You're basically trying to live in a way that's contrary to being human. So I think for all of those reasons, I think that's one of the reasons why religion and religious freedom has historically, at least in the United States, had a pride of place and should be. As Andrew noted, it's not an unlimited right. You can't simply invoke it to do whatever you want, and there are limits, and certainly violence. Religion can never be a justifiable reason for committing violence against another person at whatever stage of life. So there are limits to it, but the bar should be pretty high for imposing limits on religious exercise. Andrew, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, Nathaniel, I'm just happy that you hit on. Answer was great, especially emphasizing the fact that as human beings, that natural inclination, that desire to, because what is flourishing? I mean, flourishing is really, in its simplest understanding, is becoming the best of ourselves. I mean, that's what it means to flourish. I mean, when you look at the Greeks, they would say it's a virtue. And I think they were right in that. But we take it even further as Christians, we take it even further as believers. To flourish is to become the best Andrew I can be, the best Jim, the best Mario, etc. And if I have tested, as I said earlier, that those 3 E's, explore, embrace, and express, if I understand that there is something greater than me that created me and that has a plan for me and that wants to spend eternity with me, to somehow prevent someone from doing that is not just that will not just have an isolated effect. I mean, that's going to have an effect that ripples through a community. And as Nathaniel alluded to, think of all of the remarkable things that have happened. Now, there were some bad things that have happened in the name of religion. I mean, certainly, I'm not saying that when put into human hands, our fallen nature will take things in many different directions, sadly. But there's been some remarkable things done. 1 in 7 Americans are treated in a Catholic hospital. And working in bioethics, I can tell you, when we talk about cooperation of evil, what happens if we tell Catholic hospitals, just don't be Catholic anymore? Do what the state says. I don't know if you've been to a hospital lately, but the lines, I mean, I've seen people triaged in the waiting room of the emergency room. Could you imagine putting 14% more of the population into secular hospitals simply because we told the religious, well, you can't practice medicine the way that your conscience is well informed to practice? And we can kind of go through history. Another one, because this is such an important person with regard to civil rights, religious freedom, and I think has one of the most profound resources, writings on the subject, is Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Movement, and the letter from Birmingham jail. Imagine telling Reverend King, well, you can fight for civil liberties, but just don't talk about religion. This, to not have the government with an invested interest in people to be able to take their lives in the direction that they know they ought to flourish, as we've talked about, but to also live their life in community, recognizing the importance of what their faith compels them to do, I think we would have a completely different landscape of America. And I dread the thought of what that could possibly look like.
Yeah, just to add to that, the abolition movement would have either not been or would have collapsed. The suffrage, the same is true of the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement. I mean, basically every positive social change movement in the United States has been largely propelled by religious people. And it's interesting because some of the people who object to, for example, the pro-life movement, obviously overwhelmingly people who are involved in the pro-life movement in different ways are religious of one kind or another, Catholics to other kinds of Christians, some Muslims and Jews as well. They will say, well, religion doesn't really belong in the public square. You'll hear that a lot. But when you talk about other things, for example, people who are religious who are advocating for change in immigration policy, or go back to, again, some of these historical examples of the civil rights movement or the abolition movement, well, that's different. And they're perfectly fine with religion in the public square. So I think ultimately, this is where the probing and the testing comes in. Often, you don't actually object to religion in the public square. It's only when religion in the public square is brought on this particular subject in this particular way. It's not the thing writ large. And I think also, people sometimes get very exercised about truth claims that are made by religious people, and they'll say, like, truth doesn't exist, or it's my truth and your truth, or it's all relative, or it's all subjective. But then you see their intensity of reaction to a particular claim or a particular action. And the question that I always have is, why are you so angry about that? Why does that upset you so much? Because I thought from your, as far as you were concerned, there is no truth and it's all relative or subjective. Well, everyone does believe in truth of some kind. We may have fights and debates and disagreements about particular truths, but I've never been convinced by the people who will say I'm a relativist or I'm subjectivist or something like that. They do believe that certain things are true. They just happen to be different things that conflict with what we assert to be true. Let
me suggest now that we do a shift from religion to conscience.
It's 10 o'clock.
It's 10 o'clock. I was going to then say, but I don't know if we have time. And the answer to that question, and it's all the fault of these articulate guests of ours. Got to blame somebody. We don't have time. So what we do is always have time for the day's gospel. And I'm going to share that with you. It's from Luke. Jesus said to the crowds, "To what shall I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They're like children who sit in the marketplace and call to one another. We played the flute for you, but you did not dance. We sang a dirge, but you did not weep. For John the Baptist came neither eating food nor drinking wine, and you said, he is possessed by a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you said, look, he's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is vindicated by all her children. Come, Lord Jesus, come." Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good.
Barely got started. I think one of the mischief makers in this is Paul Tillich, who said religion is whatever is of ultimate significance. And of course, somebody might say, what's of ultimate significance to me is staying high. I think that maybe some of you have read, but I strongly recommend Daniel Philpott's recent essay on religion and trying to define religion. I think ultimately he doesn't succeed. I think ultimately what we have to do is appeal to paradigm cases like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but that's the subject for many more discussions. And now we know that you guys are are available, we'll get you back.
All right.
Yes.
Very good. Well, we enjoyed
Thank
the
you.
conversation. Thank you.
And cut you no slack when we get you back.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.